Here is a quick outline of the topics that we'll cover here. We'll start our discussion with an introduction to the memory hierarchy in our modern computers. And for the remaining part, right, for most of the remaining part in this unit, we'll focus on caches. So let's start our discussion with that of a memory hierarchy. So I'm sure all of you own a computer, right? I'm sure all of you have extensive experiences with computers, various different types of pieces of memories, right? So these are various different types of memories inside our computers, which are also listed over here. So broadly speaking, the memories present in our computers can be divided into those internal to the CPU and those external to the processor or CPU, right? So we have already listed all of these here. So while looking at this, an important question that comes to mind is, why do we have so many different types of memories, right? So to answer this question, it is first important to realize or think about what is it that we want from the memory subsystem in our computers. So there are three things that we're looking for, right? So first of all, we want our memories to be fast, right? As fast as possible. But at the same time, we don't want to pay too much for these memories, right? So we also want them to be cheap. And the third thing that we are looking for is, we want the memories to remember our data and our programs, right? So every time we turn off our computer, we don't want the computer to forget everything, right? So we want this memory to be non-volatile. So non-volatile means it will remember the values stored there. So these are the three qualities that we are looking for in the memories of our computers. Now let's see if any of these memories that we have here satisfies all three of these requirements, right? So if you look at these registers and caches, these are fast, these are extremely fast, but they are also extremely expensive, right? So they do not satisfy the second criteria. Also, they are volatile, right? So if they are volatile, means if you turn off the power, the contents would be wiped out. So these do not satisfy all the requirements. Now let's look at this hard disk and the flash drive, right? So these are non-volatile, so that is great, they will remember the values. These are also cheap, right? As compared to the registers and caches, they are extremely cheap, but they're not fast. Unfortunately, they are very slow, right? If you compare this to registers, accessing data from the hard disk is very slow. If you look at the RAM, now RAM is somewhere in between the caches or registers and the hard disk. So RAM is well, this is faster as compared to the hard disk, but it is much slower than the register file. This is cheaper than the caches and the register file, but it is much more expensive as compared to the hard disk. So the RAM is in between. It is important to realize that RAM is also non-volatile. If you turn off the power, the contents are wiped out. So unfortunately, we have so many different candidates here, so many different types of memories, but none of them satisfy all the three requirements we are looking for in a memory, in the memory subsystem of our computers. And that is why we have so many different types of memories inside our computers. To obtain these three conditions or requirements from the memory subsystem of our computers, the designers have chosen to apply all of these memories in a hierarchy as shown here in this picture. So let's go through this hierarchy and try to understand how this memory hierarchy is satisfying the three constraints that we are looking for. So imagine that there is a CPU over here on top of this pyramid. So this hierarchy is basically in order of proximity of the given memory from the CPU, right? So you see the registers, these are inside the CPU. Similarly, L1 cache, L2 cache, these are also inside the processor. So these are very close to the CPU. The RAM is outside the CPU and it's also outside the chip. So typically this is farther away. Hard disk is yet farther away, farther than the RAM. And then the remote secondary storage, this is on the cloud, right? So this is not even inside your computer. Probably this is sitting on some server outside your city, right? So this is as you go down in this hierarchy, this basically is arranged in increasing proximity. Decreasing proximity, increasing distance from the CPU. So that's one. To answer our question, how this hierarchy satisfies the three constraints, it is important to first observe some of the trends in this pyramid. So as we go down in this pyramid, you'll note that the memories, they become slower. So that's one. So you see, if you are accessing some data that is stored in registers, this takes less than a nanosecond typically. But if you are accessing the data item in a cache, right? So L1 cache is pretty fast, but if you are accessing something from L2 cache or L3 cache, that will take a few CPU cycles. So it's slower than the registers. If you're accessing something from the main memory, this typically take tens of nanoseconds. Okay. If you're accessing something from the hard disk, now if you have an SSD, access times of SSDs are measured in microseconds. If you have a magnetic hard disk, accessing a magnetic hard disk may take up to a millisecond, right? So and for the remote secondary storage, the access times really depend on the network speed, latency, and so forth. But typically it will take longer than it takes to access the data on your local hard disk. So as you go down here in this hierarchy, the memories they become slower. The other trend that you see here is, as you go down, the memories, they become cheaper, right? So basically, if you, so let's use another color here. So you see these registers and these caches, these are deployed on chip. So space on chip is limited and it is extremely precious. So that is why these memories, they are extremely expensive. However, for the DRAM, the cost of deploying the DRAM is measured typically in dollars per megabyte. Now note that typically these registers and these caches, these are extremely few as compared to the size of the DRAM. If you go to the SSD, right? So if you have an SSD, the cost of an SSD is typically measured in dollars per gigabyte. For the hard disk, magnetic hard disk, the cost is typically measured in pennies or cents per gigabyte. Okay. So as you go down here, the cost of storage, it goes down, it becomes cheaper. And the third thing you should note here is, as we go down here, the memories, they become bigger in capacity, right? So typically if you're looking at, so let's see, if you're looking at, let's say, registers, right? So registers, they are very few in number. Typically there are 128 to 256 registers inside the CPU. The combined size of all the caches is typically few megabytes, right? So maybe 8 to 10 megabytes depending on what system you're looking at. If you're looking at the main memory, all of you would know that nowadays it is very easy to get a system, a laptop that has 16 gigabytes of main memory, right? Sizes of SSDs, again, getting 512 GB of SSD in the system is pretty straightforward these days. It's pretty common. The sizes of hard disks, they start at 1 terabyte these days, right? And the size of the remote storage, right? This really depends on your budget. It is virtually unlimited. As much as you are willing to pay for, you can buy. Okay. So as we go down here, these are three interesting trends that occur in this memory hierarchy, right? Now let's see how these trends help us satisfy the three constraints we are looking for, right? So let's start with the first was, we want this memory subsystem to be fast. So note that anytime we are executing a process, right, the instructions and data for that process would be stored inside the registers, the caches, and in the main memory, right, higher up in this hierarchy. So essentially these are the fastest pieces of memory in the hierarchy. So the executing program, because it is loaded in the registers and the caches mostly, and also in the RAM, it would get to see extremely fast memory. So that's how we get the speed. Now what about the non-volatility, right? So if we want our computer to remember something, right, if we want it to want a data item to survive the power cycle, we would save it typically inside the local storage, the hard disk, or in the remote secondary storage, so that this data or program, it survives the power cycles. This is how we get the non-volatility. Now what about the cost? So note that what we are doing in our computers is, we are deploying small amounts of fast but expensive memory, and as we go down here in the, let's say, for the hard disk, we are deploying terabytes of it, right? So we have, let's say, 16 GB of main memory and 1 terabyte of hard disk. So we are deploying small amounts of expensive memory and huge amounts of cheap memory. So by doing this, the average cost of memory per byte in our computer systems, that goes down. So that's how we get overall cheap memory in our computers.